Hi, everyone, and welcome to another PIT Colloquium. This is our Series 3 in a series that has been an incredible start to learning more about public interest technology from experts across the world. My name is Katina Michael. I'm the director for the Society Policy Engineering Collective, and a shout out to Arizona State University, the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, for helping us put this amazing PIT Colloquium series together. I'd love to also extend warm wishes to the host of who would have been today, Dr. Robert Abbas, a visiting professor at the School for the Future of Innovation in Society. We hope you get better quick. Today, we've got with us two guests, and in fact, two friends, one from industry, one from academia. Well, both of them have a mixture of both backgrounds. We've got Evagelia Emily Tavoulareas from Georgetown University, and we've also got Cyds Harrell, a consultant spanning 25 years in the technology industry with a particular focus on government. We'll begin by welcoming Evagelia, then we'll hear from Cyds, and thereafter Clarissa Murphy will be joining us, a Pitt Masters of Science student at Arizona State University, to moderate Q&A. Over to you, Emily.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Emily Tavoulareas. I also go by Evagelia, and I am the managing chair at the Tech and Society Initiative at Georgetown University. I'm also an adjunct professor at the Georgetown School for Public Policy and the Columbia SIPA School for International and Public Affairs. In my life before academia, I spent the better part of my career, about 20 years or so now, in what we now refer to as the field of public interest technology, with the last 6 to 8 years or so pretty immersed in the space of technology in government and trying to untangle some of the more, let's say, complex and maybe underperforming products and services of the government, particularly at the in the United States at the federal level. I was one of the founding members of a team called the U.S. Digital Service, and I also spent some time at the White House, kind of thinking about how to build capacity across the federal government in using technology to better serve the public. Okay, so what is public interest technology? So there is, as it turns out, as with many things, an official definition of public interest technology. This definition is pulled from New America, the Public Interest Technology University Network, with it being defined as the study and application of technology expertise to advancing the public interest, generating public benefit, and promoting the public good. Now, what I'm going to tell you a little bit more about is why that's actually, it's a little more complicated than that. That is a really good, in my view, high level definition of what the field looks like. But there's some context here that I think might be helpful to better understanding what we're talking about here. In many ways, public interest tech is really a large and diverse field of rapidly evolving disciplines that are closely related to each other. And that crosses industries and sectors of the economy. A large part of the field is policy and law because of their direct impact on people and society. But since technology touches every single part of society, this can really include everything from healthcare and education to journalism and the arts. So, and this is what I mean by it's a little bit complicated. It can touch every part of society, and it does. So a good analogy is sort of public interest law, which is why the field has sort of been framed as it has been. Like law, technology is this critical field that kind of runs across every industry, every discipline, and has a relationship to almost every single one. The field has evolved quite a lot over the years, right? And I think for many of us, this feels like a new term, but really it's a new term that has been created in order to bring some sort of scaffolding into what was essentially an organically born field. of a variety of disciplines. In my view, this has evolved over the past 20 or so years, sort of over the time span that we saw the internet sort of come into being and then sort of take over the operations of lives and industry and affect every part of what we think about and what we do. The field, like I said, has evolved sort of over the past 20 years or so, seeing sort of countless efforts that explore the nexus of technology and a variety of different issues. This has gone by a number of different names, including Civic Tech, Gov Tech, ICT for D, Tech for Good. All of these shorthands that you may have heard over time are essentially pockets of people who are working on the ground, seeking to use technology for the goal they are aimed at, right? For the outcome they want to see. But those groups were largely sort of disconnected and unaware of each other for some time, right? They were doing what they could with what they had and finding ways to use technology to further their goals. This is why international development was actually one of the spaces that came to be an early player in exploring how to use technology creatively for the delivery of public goods. So in many ways, a movement was underway, and it was so grassroots that while for many it may have felt like a field, there was no really shared language, no academic foundation, and no clear professional pathways. So in 2019, a group of universities, including the ones that I work at, came together to formalize this new field and begin operationalizing it on their own campuses to sort of provide that structure that they could do more planning and work around. There were a couple other turning points that I can point to in the sort of evolution of what we now call the field of public interest tech. But bottom line, a lot of this was ad hoc and just a number of people who saw opportunities to bring people together and did that. Personal Democracy Forum was one of the first. I believe their first conference was in 2004, to give you a sense of how early people started convening and sharing information. Ushahidi was one of the first sort of products that you could point to that was globally recognizable for their work in using technology for public good. 21 colleges and universities sort of partnered with a number of foundations to launch the Public Interest Technology University Network, and now this is where we're seeing it sort of enter the field with on more university campuses. So with that context in mind, what is public interest tech now? How can we think about that now? As someone who works in a public policy institution, I think about this largely in terms of public policy. So the way I've started thinking about this is kind of like this. You've got at the top here, sort of 6 total components. At the top, these are field agnostic, right? You could talk about, define public interest tech like we are today. You can learn about what a digital product is, how it's created, and what skills are involved and where. And then understand sort of data, the role that plays, what it is, and how it can be used in the product itself. But those do not need to be connected to a particular field. You could take those 3 and drop them in a school of public health. You could drop them in a law school, and they could be equally as relevant. The bottom 3 are more field related. So in the realm of public policy, I think about it like this. There's tech in government, which you're going to hear a lot more about today from Cyd. That's the role of impact, the role and impact of technology in the government. So like in the operations of government and how it is used to better the outcomes, to the public. Then there's government and technology. And this is more about how the government can help optimize the upside potential and manage and mitigate the downside risk and harm to the public. So this is sort of the regulatory space and creating incentives in a number of different directions for companies. And finally, this one, I haven't agreed with myself quite on the language for this one yet, but this is sort of the layer outside of government that is influencing government, right? So these are activists and advocates and not the nonprofit space and a number of players who are right outside government trying to influence the outcomes in some form. So in many ways, this is really like what we're saying here is like TLDR, tech plus anything, right? Tech, fill in the blank, tech plus climate, tech plus the arts, tech plus education. So what I'm talking about largely is focused on the policy and law component of this, but I really wanted to put a pin in that this is really, when we say public interest tech, you hear us talk a lot about government and law, but really this is about anything that technology does that has an effect on the public interest. And you can do that in any discipline. So whatever though the focus of the work, some of the shared characteristics across disciplines are diverse and interdisciplinary teams, designing and building with users, not just for them, and environments of continuous everything, continuous learning, continuous testing, continuous deployment, iteration, the list goes on and on and on. And that's whether what you are doing, what you are creating is actually tangibly technology, or possibly very often in the public space, not a technical solution. It involves a lot of different kinds of people, right? So these are not, you think public interest tech, this is engineers and designers. It's not just engineers, it's not just designers. You're talking about all of the people who are involved in the design and development of a product, but also all of the people in the ecosystem that is living in to have the outcome that it seeks, right? So depending on what you're building for, if you are, for example, to tee up what's coming next, if you are working in the justice system and aiming to simplify the relationship between and interactions between people in the system of justice, there are other people involved in that equation, right, who are outside of the technical team. You think about who all those people are. It's the person at the front office that welcomes you when you walk in the door. It's the person that hands you a form. It's the person who collects a form. It's the lawyer who's making decisions for the office. It's the director of the office, right? So there are a number of different people and a number of different roles that can play really critical, have a really critical impact on the work that's being done. Of course, there are many risks and limitations of technology, which is what a lot of the government's engagement with it is all about, from equity and ethics, like things like algorithmic bias, and also the errors of software related to software that I'll talk about in a little bit. Security, like ransomware, right? A banal sort of issue, but quite devastating on many levels. And privacy, questions of privacy related to the way that we build and use technology. The bottom line here is technology is always in service of something else. It is not the ends, it is the means, right? And we have to be very careful when we are creating it to ensure that it is deployed in service of the mission and we don't accidentally or intentionally or unintentionally make it the mission itself. And there are very good reasons why this is critical. The stakes are quite high. Complex systems create complex problems. So this is incredibly clear on a number of levels, but in the summer of 2015, on a single day, the following things happened. United Airlines grounded its fleet because of a problem with its departure management system. Trading was suspended on the New York Stock Exchange after a software upgrade. And in Seattle, the 911 system went down, just cold turkey, all on the same day. And it was so jarring that people thought it was a coordinated cyber attack, but it wasn't. It was just a coincidence, which in some ways may have been sort of worst, right? Like which is worst in this equation? And what I want to say here about complexity is that we used to be able to think through all of the things technology could do in the age of sort of in the mechanical age. Sorry about that, one second. We could think about all the different states it could get into, and every single part of the technology was tangible in some form, right? Electromagnetic and electromechanical interlockings that controlled train movements at railroad crossings, for instance, only had like so many configurations, right? A few sheets of paper could describe the whole system, and you could run physical trains against configurations to see how it would behave. But once you built it and you tested it, you knew exactly what you were dealing with, right? Software is fundamentally different than that in many really important ways. Part of the problem that we're all dealing with and we feel on different levels is that we're trying to build systems and manage systems that are beyond our ability to intellectually manage. And that, to me, really summarizes what the challenge ahead of us is with all of this, right? And in many ways, we are making decisions for a new world based on completely outdated realities, assumptions, and standards, right? So our framework for standards and like regulations related to technology was developed shortly after World War II, before the advent of software for electromechanical systems, right? So if you think about this that I was showing you earlier, right? In a world where you're dealing with electromechanical technology, you have finite configurations, they're predictable and they're testable. In a digital world, they are flexible, constantly changing, and completely abstract, right? So what we're looking at here is we're going from a world in which reliability was defined as like something that was made, it was a quality make and a lot of planning, right? And that if you made something reliable by making its parts reliable, and by planning for the breakdown of those parts. However, software doesn't break, right? So what do you do in that world? And a lot of what I've spent my time thinking about is sort of like failure and what failure states look like and why they happen, which I will save for for another time. But just because we can't see the complexity does not mean that it has disappeared. It's just invisible, which makes it much more complicated. And that brings me to one of the biggest sort of stakes of all here. And that is that in a time period where we were not necessarily paying attention to what technology was doing around us, technology has become a dependency on basically every level, right? Every single thing we do requires technology to succeed in some form or another, whether or not people are engaging with a piece of technology directly. And some examples of that were really hit home in this past 2 years. The vaccine websites, which a lot of people, I think, presented people with a front row seat to how difficult something as simple as a website can be for organizations. The delivery of public services and benefits. Even the most non-technical outcomes depend on technology to function, right? So you don't have to think only about what we normally consider in terms of software, right? Think about your car, or think about a car you've been in recently. I mean, cars are basically computers that you sit in. The steering wheel and the pedals are essentially keyboard keys, right? Like when you're driving, there's no direct mechanical link between things. The buttons you push in your car are telling a piece of software what to do. I mean, it's a car that you can sit inside of, right? It's a computer that you can sit inside of. And the same is true for airplanes, right? So when you think about what the implications are here on the regulatory side, what happens when regulators don't understand enough about the technology that powers the thing that they are charged to oversee? How can they effectively identify red flags or respond to them? And that shifts us into the space of, if you're serious about X, then you must be serious about software, right? In some form and on some level. And this is especially paramount in terms of security. This is a fantastic quote I wanted to put in here by, I believe he was the lawyer in the case against Toyota that had this like horrifying malfunction that led to cars being driven off the road. But essentially, here's what he says. He says, the software is watching the software, right? And that to me points to one of the really big considerations in public interest tech. And with a lot of the exciting new technology that's emerging, we cannot blindly trust the technology, right? Like there is this assumption that AI is going to come and do everything better than humans. Right. That might be an opportunity, but who's checking the software? And there is example after example about where this gets really, where this hits home for people. Most recently in the UK, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of post workers were put in prison because a piece of software that they had purchased, claiming that AI was smarter than people in identifying fraud, wrongfully accused people of stealing. And they were in jail for years and their lives and reputations were destroyed, right? And this is because people blindly trusted the software, right? And I will not pretend to have a solution, but that is a major risk for us to think through, especially as AI comes down the pike. And I'm almost done here. I'm just going to kind of try and speed through these last few for folks and leave some time for questions. But the problems we're presented with are unprecedented and inherently complicated, interdisciplinary, and extraordinarily ambiguous, right? They are not the tangible problems of the past that we are used to. And if you need another tangible example, sort of think about the 737 MAX, right? We were talking about regulatory standards, software safety, and they talked about safety in terms of bugs. But in that example, bugs were not the problem. The software did precisely what it was supposed to do. The answer is, or the description is, quite complex, but in short, the problem was not bugs, the problem was usability. They had essentially built software that introduced new behavior and new behavioral requirements that dramatically changed the workflow for a pilot and did not fit into the current expectations pilots had of the software that they were interacting with. So the software did what it was supposed to do, but the pilots didn't know how to engage with it, right? Which is technically a technical problem, but like, really, is it the software or is it something else, right? So one of the questions I really encourage you all to consider in whatever discipline that you come at this from is, how can we expect to optimize the upside potential of technology and effectively manage risk and harm if we don't understand it at a basic level, or if we don't have people on our teams that understand it on a basic level, who's, can I curse? who have highly well-honed bullshit meters and who we trust, right? So these are, it either has to be the decision makers, or they have to have someone on their teams who understand it in some real way, right? So, back to what it is and how to define it. It's tech plus, anything. This being the high level answer, right? But remember that it's complicated. It has a long tail and a long history. and essentially is a field that was created, we sort of backed into it. The work was happening on the ground. People were just doing what needed to be done and finding creative ways to do their work. And we sort of, this is, I'm being kind of flip here, but we like blinked, and later we thought, these all seem pretty closely connected to each other. Maybe this is something bigger than what we're doing. And that is where sort of the terminology and the desire to create a more sort of professionalized set of language and pathways and scholarship around it has begun. So it is this umbrella term for those larger, for the larger diverse field of disciplines. And again, this is how I think about it in terms of public policy, with equity, ethics, security, and privacy throughout. I don't like thinking about these as sort of their own little islands of knowledge, but these are all things that need to be baked into every single thing that we talk about, right? Into all of our disciplines and all of our language. So that's what I got for y'all.
Well, that's pretty awesome. And we have a comment here from the audience. Thank you for simplifying and, more importantly, telling it like it is. And I could not agree more. I could not agree more. You've dug really deep into PIT. And what I love is that you're just not regurgitating the established definitions that are out there. Evagelia, I'm loving the deep dive that you've done, and obviously come from experience, and also your role at Georgetown University, which is university-wide. It's not just in a school. So you're the person actually directing the traffic and receiving traffic towards you regarding what is PIT. And that equity, ethics, security, and privacy has long been at the heart of many people's research. Thank you for that preparedness. I would say, with your permission, it will be publicly available, but we will be using this video of yours, Emily, in our introductory course as one of the first lessons of 501, which is Principles of Public Interest Tech. It really does look at the world in a different way, particularly that framework at the end. And I'll leave other comments for Clarissa to reflect on, as she's one of our pioneering students going through, and hand over now straight to Sid Harrell. And then I believe there'll be a discussion between you and Sid, and then we'll go to Clarissa. Thank you so much, Emily.
Thank you.
Thank you. And of course, the siren started the second I was on audio. Let me just quiet quickly and switch screens, and hopefully that will be all done.
Sid is taunting me that she can sit outside and do this because it's like 30 degrees here.
I'm coming to you from San Francisco, where I have done this work at from various platforms at municipal, state, and sometimes for the federal government in the United States. So this all started for me not quite a decade ago, when I, as a industry practitioner doing user research and UX design, attended a hackathon, which was a pretty common thing in the civic tech space around that point. It came from Tim O'Reilly and Carl Malamud's gathering, where they formulated the idea of Government 2.0 and open data. And cities were hosting these events where they would put a bunch of data sets out onto a server and invite local technologists to come and, I don't know, do something. So I kept hearing about how much fun the engineers were having. And I decided as a designer to show up at one of these and see basically whether they would throw me out or not, because I don't code. And so my little post-it there on the unconference board was user experience, citizen experience, how to get ideas and data from the public, and how to get the design and research community involved. And I thought, I don't know, maybe I'll get 5 people. And 40 people came to my session, and I actually had to do it in the round. People were so intrigued by the idea that we could use the tools of design in that kind of work. Now, I was far from the pioneer. There are amazing antecedents both overseas and in the US. In the US, I'd particularly like to name the Center for Civic Design, which was preceded by Dana Chisnell's work with local election officials throughout the early 2000s, after the election disaster of the year 2000. About a year and a half ago, I published a short guide for practitioners, which I know some of you are using in your class. And aside from that, I am fairly typical of industry folks doing this work. This isn't all of my career because I'm older than this, but I was working at a major financial company, helping them bring stock trading onto the web and doing QA and standards and experience work for the broker's desktop on the back end. Then I was running a user research agency team when I got interested in all of this. So after that, going through Code for America and 18F at the US federal government, I've most recently been working at the California courts as an embedded consultant, and I'm going to build up to just kind of a case study of what that work has looked like over the last 3 and I guess now almost 4 years. I'm crossing out Pitt. This is something that Emily and I talked about earlier. I have a hard time identifying with it, although I use it sometimes. I feel like I do civic tech or maybe government tech, one of those specific things. I couldn't say a lot about how to work on healthcare tech or development tech, although I can definitely feel tendrils of what we do, and I am so horrified that background noise has started. I hope it's not too bad.
No, perfect. No, you keep going, Sid.
All right.
We're fine. We can hear you.
Everything's been fine all day. I am glad that the academic side is making these connections and building things into a field. But I feel what I'm mostly going to talk about is this idea that relationships between constituents and government agencies can be supported potentially through technology. So what do we want? Those of us who would say we're civic technologists, we want public digital goods, and we want them to be as good as the best commercial ones. And we also want this idea of public digital infrastructure, which you'll find Ethan Zuckerman and his team at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst exploring in great depth, and I think is really exciting. As Emily said, when tech fails, it often causes policy to fail. And just during the pandemic, just in the United States, we saw some absolutely critical failures for different reasons. We saw unemployment insurance systems where people needed to apply for public benefits when they lost their jobs at the beginning of the pandemic just fall over and not work. And we saw people wait for months to receive any money or support. We saw a political failure where the federal government chose not to aggregate COVID data across the country in the US. And that ended up being supported by a coalition of journalists and civic technologists called the COVID Tracking Project. We saw the vaccine registration websites cause everybody just a whole lot of headache. And now we're still working through how we handle vaccine credentials and testing proof and all the ways of living in the next stage of the pandemic as we interact with different institutions. Each of these things is mediated by technology and design in ways that impact the public trust and kind of the texture and experience of being part of this society. Civic tech in the United States has 2 branches, and I think this is important. I always talk about it a bit because it's different from some other countries. There was the federal branch, which gets a lot of press that started formally around 2014 after the healthcare.gov disaster. But there'd been a municipal branch for a while that came from that open data and design movement that may have started with Tim and Carl's convening, but had a few other antecedents as well. These 2 have significantly different cultures, and they clash a little bit. The municipal side has this culture of volunteerism and openness, and the federal side has a culture of service with a capital S. It's more hierarchical. It is also at a much larger scale in the things that it does. And the ways that people work in them are a little bit different. In the US ecosystem, you have a lot of government agencies, nonprofits, for-profit startups, nonprofit startups, a lot of components to the ways that people come into this and practice. One of the most explicit goals, though, is to build that modern digital capacity within government, not just deliver them something nice, but give them the ability to then own it and take it further and do something with it on their own. And I like to say to be ready for the next change. If we're still working through the current change to web and mobile, we don't know what's coming next. I don't think it's blockchain, but it's probably something. And we want our government agencies to be ready to take on that next kind of technology. So types of projects that we typically end up working on, we end up helping with service delivery projects. We end up working on infrastructure like opening data and creating new APIs or moving to the cloud. There are specific tools that only government needs, and a private company would only build if their one customer was government and might not build at all. There's also support for mutual aid that people really consider part of the ecosystem. And there are things around citizen engagement. So public meetings are a bit of a scandal in this country. They mostly attract people who have the time to show up during the day, who tend to be wealthier people. They don't collect the opinion of much of the public. And a lot of people have wondered if technology can play a role. There are some good examples and some really bad examples, and a whole lot of non-progress over a number of years that people have been working on it. One of the things that flummoxes, I think, both hardcore policy people and hardcore tech people is that the web is also almost always the entry point, and it doesn't seem serious from either perspective. But it's the sort of smooth interface where people find themselves having an interaction, if it isn't in person, is via some website. And what's underneath that website is really where the interesting stuff is going on. Models of partnership. Across different parts of the ecosystem, you may see people volunteering with a code for your city type of group, or the United States Digital Response. You may see digital groups that are hosted and supported by specific government agencies, whether that's federal or state, or many large cities now have their own digital team. And one of the interesting things about that is most of them aren't really in touch with each other. So there's an amazing team in Philadelphia, and they don't know the team in San Francisco, and they don't know the team in Boston. There are product companies that make government specific products. All of these are from left to right, processing forms better and planning transit and just managing all of your geodata. Then there are consultancies. A lot of these consultancies came out of the healthcare.gov rescue effort and aimed to build a better, more capable, more nimble, more ethical federal consulting ecosystem. Then there's a whole funder and foundation ecosystem that collects more to the academic world. And then there are sets of mutual aid groups and community-based organizations that also work on this. As someone who comes from the design world, one of the things that I've really had to internalize since my early years, really thinking I had this amazing tool that I could come in and apply to almost anything, is that design cannot fix a bad policy. In the book, I talk about it through the evolution of cannabis policy in the United States, where we could envision a great system for expunging past misdemeanor convictions. But if the local policy is that cannabis is illegal for all purposes, everywhere and always, it doesn't matter what we can envision. We have to work to change that policy before we can actually implement a great tech interface. But good design, as much as the underlying foundational tech, can really be the key factor in the success or failure of a policy implementation. And when folks like me, try to go and work with the government, one of the best things for us to figure out early is how we can actually act in a spot where policy already favors what we want to do. Otherwise, the tools of technology and design are probably not the right tools, right? We need to get with political and organizing tools and make a change so that then we have something to implement that really fits the tools that we use in this space. And even just thinking from the perspective of someone in design, there are different levels of what I call the organizational stack that we could work at if we want to solve a particular problem. And I'm just about getting to the court example where we'll see a little more of this. But We might choose to just write new content, which doesn't really involve a lot of tech. Or we might do user research and understand the constituents better. Or we might teach people within government who aren't familiar with that mode of work to do user research. But then we might also create new templates or forms, which might be paper or might be digital. Maybe we'd even replace the publishing system, which is a significant effort, might get us into, say, procurement processes and other business processes and adoption. We might integrate databases or create new APIs. And sometimes if we can access it, the best play is actually to get the data and IT and comms group to be working together more harmoniously and closely and in a more collegial way across what are often silos within a government organization. So my biggest guiding set of questions in thinking about where I might do work is, can I relieve pain for end users? Can I relieve pain for stewards and maybe free up capacity, knowing how overworked and underfunded government workers are? Can I do something that will actually last past me engaging with a particular agency? And can I work somewhere where I have access and support and maybe I'm not also doing a parallel track of fighting for those? If you were a designer in industry like me, the things that would surprise you when you went into government are that there are almost no design staff, formally, almost ever. And this often relates to the fact that there are no design job classes within government unions or ladders or titles for designers. So people are often bolting on design responsibilities to something like a business systems analyst job title that pre-exists. Sometimes there's no software. This is probably the least important. There's sometimes no ability to buy software as a service because most of those companies are optimized for monthly credit card subscriptions, and many governments don't offer access to credit cards. Simple thing like that can make a whole lot of work in government really tricky to do. Very, very common to have no sandbox environment. So everything you're doing is going to go straight onto the site, and there aren't really protections. There may just be a lack of fluency in this weird language of strategy and design that I talk as part of my professional life. And one of the oddest ones is that there's a pretty common myth that user research isn't legal or somehow isn't quite legitimate. And I know Emily was part of some of the efforts to debunk that at the federal level and how that interacts with the Paperwork Reduction Act. But it comes up pretty often that we have to reconvince people that this basic tool of design and industry is actually okay to use. Public servants are often used to more deliberative processes of engaging with the public, where there's formal comment, and the idea of sitting down one-on-one and seeing one person perspective of working with some artifact is just new. Taken all together, we often find an environment that, compared to even a large tech company, has really high complexity, but often has really low digital maturity. And that makes it difficult to do things like say, well, Google is a really big mature tech company, so let's adapt their practices over to the state of California. Google has been through 15 years of refinement based on a profit motive that gives them really clear signals about what's working and what's not, and has an enormous amount of infrastructure underlying all of the things that they currently deliver. The state of California has different versions of those things, sometimes no versions of those things, and so we're often at a loss for what to apply. One really specific example is that modern industry writing about, say, analytics for websites or tools assumes that pretty much everything is either a e-commerce funnel, so we're trying to step everybody through it and get them to the end of the road, or an engagement model on a media type of site, and neither of those typically fits a public sector case very closely. And then there's just the complexity of government in a country of this size. There are an awful lot of government bodies. One of the things that we really struggle with as a field is, if we do something in one place, how broadly can it be used? How can we make it accessible to all of these bodies' constituents at the right time and place? Okay, you all probably know this. This is basic. This is the 4-level cake that we have in the United States of how things are actually done by government. And as an example, between city and county, the county executive has a sheriff, the mayor has local police, you may have vital records versus building permitting. And people who go into this without studying government don't always know the right place to even work on the issues that they're interested in. If you take, for example, food benefits, what happens is that Congress appropriates money to one of the cabinet departments, which then grants money to the 50 states with certain restrictions and reporting requirements. In California, the administration of the program to give people food benefits is delegated to our counties, which we have 58 of. And then within the counties, there are different community-based organizations that actually help people apply for and secure the benefits. So it's a very, very complex ecosystem, even at a summary level. So I wanted to finish up the us talking portion of this by telling you a little bit about what I've been doing at the California courts, because I think it's an interesting illustration of some of this. I've been there since middle of 2018 with a mission to improve access to civil justice through digital means. California court system has about 7.5 million cases every year. And for about 80% of them, if they're not a criminal case, at least one side doesn't have an attorney. This wouldn't be true in a criminal case because you're guaranteed an attorney, even though those offices are overstressed and overworked. There is some access. We have 58 superior courts for each county. And then we have an appellate system with appeals courts and a Supreme Court. And this is the kind of website that the courts were running. On the left, you can see kind of how it was, and on the right, what we're starting to improve. They also, after asking us to improve their website, mentioned that they have about 1,200 standardized required forms that are used in the court system. These are 8.5 by 11 paper PDF forms. Not all of them are one page, and they don't employ a single information designer. The forms are created by committees of judges and attorneys, and they typically use Microsoft Word leading into Adobe Experience Manager and outputting fillable PDFs, although that ecosystem is starting to become a bit shaky. This is one of them. This is actually kind of important. It's what you might call paternity in a casual way. If you need to an official court determination that someone is the parent of a child and has some responsibility for them, this is the form that you need to fill out, and it's quite difficult. If you're a designer, you'll notice a bunch of mess ups. The grouping is bad. The labeling next to the boxes is bad. The language is just really difficult for a regular person to understand. You're looking at the English version. There is a Spanish and a Chinese and an Arabic version as well. Again, no design positions. So given this huge mission of increase access to justice in this situation through digital means, we went and did a lot of research. We got to visit 20 of the 58 courts and spend time not just meeting people waiting for assistance in court waiting rooms, but shadowing the clerks who receive filings from the public and from attorneys, sitting in courtrooms and watching calendars get called, and going backstage through all the spaces that the public doesn't ordinarily have access to. And I would say an overall impression of going to court without a lawyer is, oh God, what is all this stuff that I need to do? Am I going to mess up and really hurt myself here? But then backstage, even though things are kind of 20th century with tons of physical stamps and colored cover sheets and so forth, it's very organized. And people who work there understand at a minute level which different form packet belongs with which problem. And typically you have to talk to somebody to kind of match what you're doing with what you actually need to fill out. And then you have to confront the problem of filling out a huge number of forms, submitting them, and waiting to see what happens. So spoiler, we're building a website. It's coming along actually really nicely, but a website means a lot of things. So even in plain language procedural content, my first bullet, there's a whole lot in there. What does that mean? How plain language can it be? Who is it for? Who is comfortable with it? form filling instructions and referral, how to find the right courthouse, because if you go to the wrong courthouse, they're not going to take your filing and you're going to have to go maybe across the county 200 miles. How to look up the right form. And then opportunistically, we got the chance to build a feature to help people submit their income and other information if they get a traffic fine that they can't afford to pay. And it's looking better. So this is some of our early sites about how to go through the process of getting a divorce and what the basic steps are and who's doing what at what time, all in relatively short chunks of text. Some other things a website means. Actually, they needed a new CMS. So we had to get into procurement and we had to get into evaluation. We needed a design system, a set of web components that people can put together to publish pages. And it's based on a federal project that 18F and USDS did together. They actually really needed release processes because when you're putting meaningful stuff out for the public, it's kind of not okay if the site goes down for 2 or 3 days and nobody internally notices. We've been doing a lot of coaching on digital practices, but maybe one of the most important things we've managed is to get them to create and hire a web content attorney position, which is somebody who is an accomplished attorney and also understands how the web works and kind of modern digital practices. And so she can speak in a way that we as outside people couldn't to what needed to happen with plain language content for the public. Industry skills here that I'm using, helping just write strong briefs for vendors and understand what you might get, doing everything from coaching internal staff to writing job descriptions to coaching managers on what they can do to support design research happening. Very little of this is hands-on designing, although I do a little bit of that as well. I think one of the things that has most struck me through this process and all of my work in this area is that public servants' design decisions have a much bigger impact than the entire design industry. And most of them don't have access to design practice or design community, the things that I have easy access to as a practitioner in the field. And so part of what I see my work as is bringing that practice and that community to those public servants, and honestly bringing their great problems to solve and really smart insights to the design community in reciprocation. So yeah, I think that is my very quick overview of what I do and somewhat how it fits into the field of public interest tech. And I'm so curious to hear all of your questions and maybe Emily's reactions first. I'll stop sharing so that we can chat. Ooh.
Over to you both, Emily and Cyd, and thank you so much, Cyd. It sort of mirrors a lot of our learnings from your book this session, in Principles of PIT. What an amazing book it is.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love that. As you were talking, Cyd, it really it brought to light sort of just how little of sort of, I think the definition that I laid out has to do with what's happening in the field, right? And like what's happening on the ground, which like makes me extra appreciate the line through the pit in the beginning of your, of your talk, which in many ways is the spirit of what this whole field is, right? If you remember what I started with, like,
there's these people doing things.
Yeah, it was just these people doing stuff. And then suddenly they were like, maybe something bigger is going on here.
And it really is, and it really does matter, right? Because for this work to be transparent to researchers and to other organizations who we hope can support it, it needs to have that formalization and standardization of terms and so forth.
Yeah.
But I said in my day-to-day work, like, I don't really care what the definition of PIT is.
That's right. It's really, it's interesting because it, like I said, I think it's like it is a sort of a manifestation of how the field sort of grew from the bottom up, which is just focused on solving problems at the hyper-local level. Like, we're trying to improve a system, we're trying to improve access, and everything you're talking about is like squarely in that realm.
Right. Yeah, and I think, you've found in your work too, how things that are written for the private sector tech industry are kind of inadequate to people trying to learn how to do this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I see, it's hard also not to see that gap in academia itself, I have to say, where we have a lot of people who have been living and breathing their discipline and their subject matter and know it deeply, but have not been in those institutions doing that work. And I think the more we can build connective tissue between the people who are doing this, like this thinking at what is often a layer of abstraction, with the people who have to like live and breathe the consequences of the policies, right? And who are implementing it or trying to make change in an institution, right? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, there's a bunch of interesting stuff that I'm really nervous about, but I think, which is a sort of, how quickly can we write policies into code and test them, which always appeals, I think, to people from the tech side and often appeals to people from the policy side. And it gives me pause because I do think prototyping is a really interesting way to test policy. And that's a very industry practice. Like, let's just build something fast and figure we're going to throw it away. And then in my work in government, I've so often seen, a prototype that is meant to be thrown away by a high resource tech team get adopted and still be being used 2 years later and really not doing everything that it should do for the government team that's meant to use it. And still is difficult to change if there's a policy change.
Yeah, it's hard to turn it on. Once it exists, it's hard to turn it off. Cyd, actually, you mentioned something that I wanted to probe on a little bit more, which is the role of the website. What we often talk about sort of in the world of civic tech is sort of tech as a Trojan horse for sort of the real work. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true in the private sector too, right? I think I showed that I worked at Charles Schwab for a number of years, and one of the things that was happening was trading was coming online. And they are a mainframe-based company, or were at the time, and they were really proud of this 99% uptime that they had maintained for decades. And it turns out that 99% uptime means you're down for 15 minutes a day. Not a big deal if everybody's calling you on the phone and your brokers can cover for you. But if it's web-based and the mainframe goes down for 15 minutes that happen to be at, say, market close, you're going to make the Wall Street Journal. And so you have to reevaluate a whole bunch of business processes and business standards and what you think are really excellent performance, sort of notionally, because there's now a website, because the web enables your public to see deeper into your organization. And so I think civic technologists at first unwittingly and later wittingly think about, are we able to intentionally and while limiting damage run that kind of cycle with public sector agencies of various sorts? It's also an incredible way to teach people to think in a tech way. So if I build a website with some lawyer, some awesome lawyer like my colleagues at the courts, it's much more effective for them coming out feeling like they can use the material of digital to do something for their constituents than me just running a slide deck,
Yeah.
So it kind of has those two things of where it's like a path deeper into organizations.
Yeah, it opens the door to if you really want to solve problem X, here's all the other stuff we should probably tackle, right? And the example of the marijuana convictions, right, is a really good one where if you build, I forget what the quote is at this point or who it even was from originally, but I love if you build digital on top of a broken thing, you get a broken digital thing, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like
Pope?
I don't remember, but I just I love it so much. And you can also replace broken with any other adjective, right? Like you can,
discriminatory,
discriminatory, complex, unjust, right? So it really, that really hits home.
Yeah. We do this for hours sometimes, and I think we should invite Clarissa in.
Yeah, I was just going to say.
It's so great to hear you guys and to listen and to really just get an eye or an perspective on how when tech fails, policy fails. As someone who works in the industry, I'm a product manager for a media company. People have approached me asking me, hey, what's your next step after you have your degree? And so I'm going to jump ahead from the knowledge to how do you actually get into the industry? What are some tips? What are some tricks? Do you volunteer first? Do you get a fellowship? What is the right next step so that you can apply everything you've learned into the day-to-day?
That's a great question. I think 10 years ago, I would have said you volunteer first, but I don't think you have to anymore. I think there are a lot more government jobs that recognize sort of technology categories. And there's also this ecosystem. In particular, the sort of new school consultancies are a great place for people who've been in the tech industry to transition. That would be your Navas, your Ad Hocs, A1M, Trustworks, Skylight Digital. Who am I forgetting? There's a lot of them now, which is great. But they tend to provide a fairly like tech industry like environment to give you a home to go back to after you go and do the difficult work, and sort of learn your way into another environment.
But what about people who don't have that tech background, but they have more of like maybe a policy or a public admin background, or they're just not as tech savvy, but they see the need and they have that desire and that goal?
I love this question for so many reasons, but primarily because I think everyone has a different answer to this right now. And I love hearing everybody's answers to this question. So +1 to everything Sid said. I think my answer to this, and it is also related to sort of my instinct on the first one as well, which is, I think that particularly if you are already through the primary part of your higher education, right? And you have like work experience and you're looking for like, what's the next step? I think it makes sense to start with where your strengths currently are and think about how those relate to the technology, right? So like if your strengths are, you really know how to build websites, right? You can think about, where would I like to point that skill, right? If you really know an institution very well, right? Like if you've spent your whole life, your whole professional career working, in the United Nations, for example, that's like a big system that's, and in there as a full-time employee, that might be the thing you bring to the table, is I really know this institution and I can help other people wayfind and navigate their way through this to these ends. And I might think of that as the starting point, and then think about, where are your interests and where do you want your career to go? And that you can gain that experience and and those connections by raising your hand for something that's happening maybe on your team or proximate to you, or taking a quick class on something, or volunteering and starting to sort of get a finger into another space, right? Like take a step into another space and add that to your repertoire, and maybe you find yourself going down that road later. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we have a great question actually from Jason. Jason, I don't know if you want to unmute to ask, or I can ask if you would feel more comfortable.
Yeah, hi everybody. Hello from down under.
Hello.
So I actually posted a question, but then I think I've got a better one, and Katina will love this. When do you actually need to have policy? What is the cutoff here? So if I'm in the field doing something, should I have a policy to guide me? Or when can I just get on with it and not need a policy? Can you answer that one?
Oh man, that's a good question. It's good to have a policy.
Is it going to be like a legal thing that I'm going to step into trouble and therefore I should have had a policy?
Quite possibly. I think there are emergency efforts where it's all hands on deck. We need to make something work. and maybe you don't need much thought about policy at that point. But the idea that you can do the tech without expressing a policy is probably not that solid. So, you know, when you think about, okay, well, I want to make a better interface for applying for food stamps. Well, that's going to necessarily involve who you're going to make it for and how easy you're going to make it. And as you think you're building a tech thing, you're very quickly getting into reinforcing or combating or changing an actual policy. And if you don't have one, if you have an ideal of being apolitical, you're just going to reinforce whatever is in place with, you know, all of its benefits and all of its harms.
The other thing I would just add here is I think there's a distinction between small p policy and big P policy.
Good point. Yes.
Yeah, which like if you're talking big P policy 100% on Cyd's side, the other is like the small p policy is like how things are implemented at the institutional level, and that is a lot of like SOPs type stuff. So like how the work happens and like internal kind of rules about the way things occur that are not like laws, but are just sort of like internal practices. And I feel, you know, I actually am finding myself wondering, was there ever a case in which sorry, there are toddlers screaming in the background, as you can hear. Was there ever a case in the work that we did in which we had to create the policy and we're not reacting to a policy or finding our way around a really terrible policy or an outdated policy?
I think with tech policy, we often do get involved, right? You know, what can be purchased, who can use what kinds of things can be done online as opposed to in person. Those are all tech policy questions. And I think that we often end up involved.
Oh yeah. Yeah, like
right?
HTTPS. Yeah, I'm going to write a few examples here.
Right. .gov implementation, FedRAMP, which is a federal standard for application security and getting an authority to operate within the federal government. But in micro, and it's much easier to implement at, say, city level, you know, I've helped the courts procure Ethnio, which is a SaaS user research recruiting product that really fell outside their ordinary purchasing practices. So I helped change a little tech policy so that they could get access to survey people on their website and see if they wanted to participate in interviews. But yeah, I get very nervous now, and I wouldn't have 10 years ago, with not getting what the policy landscape is.
So how about if maybe on the little P side, a student project team who's overseas and, you know, there's no sort of guiding policy, but this leads into my question I put into the chat. So what makes a good policy writer? So what characteristics would you have? So let's say I take a student project team in remote community overseas, to get them to have an attempt at building their own policy of what they think should be in, I think would probably be a good idea as a starting point. But if they want to move into policy writing and policy work as ICT professionals, do they sort of need the same skills as a technical writer, you know, to translate the jargon and have that clarity? And here's the step through, you know, in building a system or installing an operating system. So if you think policy writing, what are the sort of characteristics that would be good for my students to have to move into that field?
I'm happy to jump in. So, you know, I think it depends. This is like the most unsatisfying answer in the world, but it depends a lot on what problem they're trying to solve, I think. And particularly being in a context that is not your own, I think becomes really tricky in making decisions that will sort of outlive you likely, or outlast you in the place that you are temporarily, and then, you know, and then leaving. So I think there are a lot of considerations there, but my personal kind of approach to anything that smells of change management, like any kind of sort of institutional change or sort of change on the delivery of services, improving on service delivery, like we've been talking about, there are a couple things I default to. And number one is being embedded within the environment that you seek to affect and work. So thing one. Thing two, working like side by side collaboratively as a team with the people who are going to inherit the thing that you are doing. Right. And like in that space, because if you go off into a safe little corner and like create something based on your own assumptions, and then you like try and plug it into a different system, the system will reject it. Right. It is much more likely that what you want to do will stick if it's done within the institution or organization with the same people within their systems and all of that. So that's just sort of a mode of operating and kind of like an MO. Sorry, go ahead, Sid.
No, I was going to say, in terms of also the particular skills that are useful in this kind of translation-y, tech writing-y policy work, information architecture is really helpful, which is a tech industry skill set that, breaks apart either data or content and puts it back together. I think I often find myself thinking that direction. I also find a lot of strategy skills really useful, and facilitation. So even as a writer, in an approval heavy environment, you're going to be needing to get a lot of people on board with what you're doing. And so, learning how to facilitate meetings and exercises as part of your development of whatever you're writing is, oh yes, product management from Clarissa as well. Yeah.
Yeah, both of you sort of draw stuff, map stuff out, the conceptual ideas, how it fits together to have a better understanding.
Sometimes, yeah.
All the time, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, depending on the thing, but I mean, this is also what I suggest to my students, like when we talk about problem solving and like in the public space, in the public arena. What I encourage everyone to do is define the problem and then map the problem, right? So like define it with words, and then like think about the whole ecosystem of the problem, right? All of the different layers, the obvious ones, but also the things that are like budgets, like where does the money go? Who are the decision makers? What are the systems? What are the forms?
Core values. This is a little run of slides that I didn't include today that I have about the value of accuracy in the court system. One of the biggest difficulties we ran into in working with longtime lawyers who want to write for the public is there's just an enormous gulf in knowledge of the legal system, as you'd expect. And they would write these just elaborate, long, multi-clause sentences that are really hard to translate, really hard for a typical Californian to understand. And I said, but this is accurate. So I finally got to the point where I was like, damn it, what does accurate mean? How do you know if something is accurate or not? And we got to this really useful definition that amongst legal professionals, it means it's comprehensive and precise. And that the things that you do to make it comprehensive and precise, kind of along with the slightly adversarial culture of the legal profession, where people are going to poke holes in what you've written to see if it's comprehensive and precise, and that's how you're going to judge it, really don't lead to writing that gives our average Californian constituent an accurate impression of, say, what they need to do next after they file their first set of papers. And so if we could just shift the definition to a regular, ordinary Californian taking away an accurate impression, and that could be, on certain parts of the web at least, the definition of accuracy that we play to, that would really make a big difference. But that doesn't include a single Post-it note or like design exercise or anything like that. It's just talking and thinking and taking frustrated walks,
This is why I think that's a good example of what I mean by like the embedded approach as critical, because the reason Cyd could do that is because she was there, right? Like she was a trusted entity that had the ability to have that conversation and had sort of the what I'll refer to as the emotional quotient, right? Like the EQ.
Say my
to,
superpower is asking rude questions politely.
Asking rude questions politely, exactly. But Jason, to your question about other skills, I mean, I think the other piece of this, in addition to like the approach and sort of the ethos of the work, is that there are specific skills that tend to be really useful, like IA, information architecture, like plain language writing, design research skills. But I think the other piece of this is that interdisciplinary teams are increasingly critical, and helping students develop the muscles they need to work with people who are from completely different disciplines is really critical to this space in particular. I think more broadly as well. But
and I think from a time perspective, I'd love to get Melissa in. She asked a really great question in the chat.
I do find all of this, content and technology and just how we make systems better important. And I was wondering, like, with policy, like how some companies won't be accountable until policy is reactively made after a big oopsident. So I was wondering if you guys could talk more about like ownership of accountability within companies, tech companies, and how policy can play a role in that, or play a role against that, or make companies take little shortcuts to try and overcome policies. For example, like one example that comes to mind is the COPA stuff that happened with YouTube within the past few years, and just how that completely changed the environment there. How we're seeing continuing examples of things.
do you have any thoughts, Sid, before I jump in?
I think you can start, unless you'd rather I start. I mean,
it's going to be like that really unsatisfying, like, it depends. I mean,
like you have to follow the policy, right? For it to matter.
Yeah, it depends. I think it depends on a lot of things, in particular, what institution it is and how much, what the public expects of it. Right? Like, so the public's expectations of YouTube's behavior are very different than the public's expectations of the Department of Veterans Affairs, right? So I think that plays a really significant role. And what it ends up looking like often is that, in my humble opinion, companies are way less concerned with accountability because no one's ever really held them accountable for anything. And the accountability is like a slap on the wrist, and they're like, cool, I'll just go keep doing that and pay my parking ticket every once in a while. So there's no, in my view, like real incentive or real accountability measure for private companies, with a couple exceptions if you're like in the space of like biomedical and like healthcare tech, financial
certain
tech
sectors.
Yeah, there are like certain sectors in which there's a lot more regulation, but in terms of like most of the products we interact with daily, not really. On the government side, what it ends up looking like is an aversion, sort of like an overcorrection, and a swing in the other direction, where they want to outsource all the accountability and risk. And this ties very closely to procurement and the presence and abundance, again, in my humble opinion, of particular companies, in particularly the U.S. State and federal governments, where there is an over-reliance on those companies to do this work, partly in order to shift accountability. But I'm a jaded jerk at this point, so I'm just being jaded.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. I mean, and then there's also the question of like, is it a statute? Is it a regulation?
Yes, yeah.
What we often say that like writing technology specifics into statute is generally a really bad idea. there's all kinds of election departments in the US where like 12-point font is written into the statute, and actually it'd be nice to design something else, but you have to go through a legislative process to change it. And so, yeah, I think policy is one component of accountability, but it doesn't do it on its own. Policy plus public power plus transparency plus alignment, maybe you're getting somewhere. But those things are hard to create in our information ecosystem. I think that's where we're getting more towards Ethan Zuckerman and others' work around, you know, what is our public digital infrastructure to cope with all of this?
Yeah, I fully agree. And the other part of the other kind of part of this is that the relationship currently between the policy and the tech, at least from the places that I've been working on it, is that the policy people do the policy and like the tech people do the tech. And often the tech people doing the tech is like, I'm going to hire fill in the blank, you know, contractor for an obscene amount of money and have them develop the tech that I am asking for. And what they have not realized is that those are inherently the decisions that that technology company is making, that contractor is making, inherently will have an impact on that policy. So part of the accountability is that either intentionally or unintentionally, what has happened is the technology and the policy are kind of accountable to different masters in some ways, where the policy people believe their job has been done and that like my accountability to the public is covered here. And this company is going to build this thing that I asked for. And then there's this game of finger pointing as to like when things go wrong, as to like who's to blame. You didn't ask for it the right way. You didn't build it the right way. Right. And you can see the little Spider-Man gif like of, you know, of people just pointing at each other. So
yeah,
in any case, those are my thoughts on accountability.
It's right back to that it's complicated slide.
Yeah. Well, it's all very closely tied together. And this is why sort of bringing it back to the like embedded teams that Sid was also talking about, right? Like being there and working with closely with different parts of the equation is critical because they're not two separate things. They're the same thing, right? The decisions that like Sid is making about like different pieces of the, you know, the court's technology is inherently connected to its operations, and they're like both big P and small p policy.
Yeah, this is a great conversation. Wonderful questions. Thank you so much for answering and for asking. I'm going to close now. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day or night or afternoon, wherever you are. We look forward to connecting offline.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great week. Bye.